Well, hello everybody. Now, as you will probably be aware, the USS New Jersey went into dry dock earlier this year. This was successfully carried out. She's now back at her berth, and if this video is going up around about the time it should be, then in a week or so's time I will be on her back at her port in Camden in order to be part of the lecture series that she's doing about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But whilst a lot of you did actually go out there and visit the ship, tour her in dry dock, and a few of you were kind enough to come out and take a guided tour specifically with myself, there are of course an awful lot of you who couldn't make it out to the ship for one reason or another. In a lot of cases just the sheer distance, because ultimately she is on the east coast of the US and not everybody lives on the east coast of the United States. And so while I was giving the tours of the dry dock, which obviously contained a ship and not water, as you can see here, this is while they were flooding the dry dock in preparation for the ship arriving, I had a word with Ryan and I said, well, look, there's a lot of people who are going to really want a tour of the battleship while she's in dry dock, so can I do a video about it? And of course, Ryan said yes, but for obvious reasons, if I put it out while the ship was in dry dock, then that is competitive with the people who are actually paying to go and see the ship. So we agreed, right, okay, I'm going to wait a little bit until the ship is out of dry dock, so there is no longer any opportunity for you to see her in dry dock. So this is that video. Additionally, whilst, as those of you who actually came and took a tour with me will know, I did actually record those tours with a camera strapped to my head. I was initially planning on using those because obviously you'd hear then what I was saying while I was there, but when I was reviewing the footage, although the footage is crystal clear and the voice recording is actually also very clear, there's an awful lot of rapid movement because I move my head around to look at people, answer questions, look up at bits of the ship, duck so I don't hit my head on bits of the ship, etc. And I think if anyone suffers from any degree of motion sickness, it might prove a little bit difficult to watch. So instead, I'm going to be using a combination of pictures and video that I shot while I was there when people mostly weren't there. So you'll get some rather exclusive views of the ship in dry dock without also getting the full dry dock tour experience, because that's obviously fairly exclusive. But I was lucky enough to be able to get rather specific permission for drone operations around the ship, which, it was not easy to do considering it's Philadelphia Navy Yard and you've got the airport right there, but within a very, very certain amount of boxed area, as long as I kept looking at the ship and as long as most of the operations were actually below 0 feet because we were in the dry dock, I was able to do that. So I'm going to be using that as background while giving a mildly abbreviated version of the tour that I gave while I was there. So sit back and enjoy, and if you want to help USS New Jersey out, there is a link in the video description as well, because of course they're the ones who facilitated all of this. So a little bit about the dry dock first. This dry dock was not in fact built to hold an Iowa-class battleship, although as you can see it does that job very well. This dry dock was built originally to hold Lexington-class battle cruisers, but fortunately the overall size and dimensions of those as planned happens to match up pretty much with an Iowa-class battleship, and so as you can see USS New Jersey fits in quite nicely, although there is not a huge amount of clearance down either side, let me tell you that much. And this is New Jersey's 4th visit to this particular dry dock. The first visit was immediately after her launch, which took place only a few hundred yards to the right of the current viewpoint, and there's a bit of a story about that for later on, but she was also in dry dock after her trials. So she went out on trials after fitting out here, came back and had a few issues fixed. She was then brought back in during the Cold War period. She obviously had other refits and other stays in dry docks, but her third visit to this particular dry dock was during the Cold War around the Vietnam era. And then of course this particular visit in 2024. And the reason the dry dock was completed, even though the Lexington-class battle cruisers originally obviously weren't, was because, well, one, the money had already been allocated, work had already commenced, but also, of course, Lexington and Saratoga were converted to aircraft carriers, so the need for dry docks capable of taking a hull that size was still extant. Plus, of course, you have the other issue. If you've planned to build a ship this size, and you'd have, in 2 cases, built a ship this size already, then you might end up building more ships that size. So definitely a good idea to complete the infrastructure works, even if the ships they were originally intended for never saw the light of day in their intended forms. And now, as you can see, we are down in the dry dock itself. We're passing by the ship's 2 rudders. Each of those is actually hollow. So if you walk up to it and wrap your knuckles on it, well, 1, if you do it too hard, you'll hurt your knuckles, but 2, they will actually ring hollow, and that is in part to lessen the strain on the steering motor, so you don't need quite as heavy steering gear. Of course, most of the force the steering gear is exerting is to counter the force of the water passing by, but it also means, as being relatively lightweight as far as rudders go, you can also manually steer them in the event that you actually have to do that using big wrenches inside. Although if you do have to do that, that's something has gone horribly wrong. The other thing you'll notice, of course, is the propellers. And yes, this portside outer one does have a chunk taken out of it. No, nobody knows how that happened. But one thing you will also notice is that the inboard propellers, as you can see here, have 5 blades on them, and the outboard propellers have 4 blades on them. And this is because if you use more blades, like these inboard ones, that gets you more power, but is somewhat less efficient due to interference between the blades as one blade passes by a certain fixed point and leaves a vortex behind it, and the next blade arrives in that vortex. Whereas a fewer bladed propeller will have a more efficient method of transferring its energy into the water, but of course cannot transfer quite as much energy. And this is why 3-bladed propellers are quite common on a lot of ships, but the Iowas, being somewhat fast vessels for their size, and to be honest, more generally, they needed more powerful propellers as a whole, so hence the 4-bladed ones on the outside, which are somewhat better for cruising. They'll be a little bit more efficient than the 5-bladed ones, but then if you really want to put pedal to the metal, then that's what your inboard propellers are for, with those 5 blades there. And of course you can see the 5-bladed props are directly behind the rudders, because having prop wash driving onto the rudders gives you the best action for those rudders, because of course there is the most force being exerted on them. Even if the ship is relatively stationary, if the propellers are moving water past the rudders, then the rudders will begin to turn the ship even at low speeds. The rudders can, of course, also be turned independently of each other, so in the event of battle damage, if one is jammed, you can still work the other, and that also means you can do the famous barn door stop, i.e. turn the rudders in towards each other, creating essentially a massive air brake but for water. Now, that does have some negative side effects. As far as we know, USS Wisconsin is the only Iowa-class ship to actually do this, and apparently she had problems with slightly loose vibrating rudders thereafter for a while. I can only imagine why. Now, as you'll see here, the ship has, at the point of this recording been done, already had her underneath coatings done. So there are some videos on USS New Jersey's channel showing the 3 layers of coating that were done up to this stage. They're done in 3 separate layers, 3 separate colors as well, and that means that in future, if divers go down, if they see a red color, then that's fantastic. And if they see either a grey or a tan colour, then they know how much of the coating system is worn through. And if it gets down to a tan colour, then they know they're down to their last layer of protective coating outside of the steel of the hull. So then something rather urgent needs to be done. Another thing you'll notice as we take a slightly closer look in here is there seem to be silver lines projecting. At the moment, they're just between the outer and inboard rudders from our perspective. So I'm not talking about the little lines on the top, but those slightly more solid lines, and you might have seen them in other parts of the footage earlier. They look like metal bricks attached to the outside of the hull. These are the ship's new anodes. Now, the vessel previously had a bunch of zinc anodes fitted to it, and you can see there's a line on the left appearing and on the right just as we go into the area between the 2 skegs which support the inner shafts. Now, the problem is zinc anodes are the traditional way of doing things. unfortunately, zinc anodes are somewhat less effective in protecting the ship in brackish or fresh water, which is what New Jersey sits in. So whilst the old zinc anodes have been removed, and if you want to own a big chunk of zinc, you still can, they've got them for sale at USS New Jersey, they were then replaced with aluminium anodes. So those of you who have drunk American-made aluminium, well, not aluminium beer, but beer in American-made aluminium cans, you've been theoretically, potentially contributing to USS New Jersey's refit, because each of those anodes is now made up of a bunch of crushed and recycled beer cans. Another thing you'll notice as we come up past here is just below where it says New Jersey, there's a bunch of what look like rubber scuff marks. Indeed, those are rubber scuff marks. Those were left behind by the tugs that manoeuvred the ship both from her berth further downriver to Paulsboro and then back up from Paulsboro to here in order to get her properly aligned, because of course she wasn't proceeding under her own power. So those would need to be removed and then sprayed over later on once the ship is out of dry dock, but they were very, very visible at the time, obviously, that we were in dry dock. And another thing you'll note while we're up here above the ship is this wonderful expanse of fairly freshly laid teak decking. This is another part of the ship's preservation work, which is an ongoing procedure. You can see the teak decking shop there, just coming up to the bottom centre of shop, and that's where they store all the tools and equipment for that. Now, when I first visited USS New Jersey back in 2022, they were working on the aft section that we're currently just above, and you can see here the various fire control systems for the main battery and also for the secondary battery, as well as the Harpoon and Tomahawk missile launchers. But over time, that decking work has progressed further and further forward to the point that at this stage they were working on the forecastle decking, and who knows, by the time I visit the ship again, it may even be done. Now, panning back here, I'm looking over turret 3. This is the aftmost of the 16-inch 50 turrets, and you can see the rivets on top of the turret there. Because the rivets and bolts, you need to be able to remove the turret roofing if you need to replace a gun. And it's not because it's damaged, it may be that the gun just needs relining. So as we head back over, there's me down there being escorted to make sure I don't do anything dodgy. You can also see just behind us the capstan on the other side of the road where that car's just passing. That's the capstan that hauled the ship into the dry dock, and that's connected obviously to a very powerful motor underneath. And that little trailer with the blue cable on it that we just panned past, that is actually the cable that was used to pull the ship into the dry dock, just sitting there nice and neatly ready for viewing. And now we're going to drop back down into the dock. You can see there a cherry picker that was being used to clean the ship and then paint it up earlier. And you can also see these gun tubs right here on the stern. Now, originally, of course, those would have held 40mm Bofors guns, but they were later repurposed as part of the ship's helicopter and drone complement later on. So now we've dropped back down, and one of the things you're going to notice as we head back down is, of course, that the skegs that the inner prop shafts are on are also sitting on dry dock blocks, and that's because you have the keel, the central spine of the ship, which is of course being supported by blocks, but there are additional docking keels which the skegs are actually a component of to help both spread the load and balance out the ship when it's in dry dock, because if you balanced it all on the keel, even assuming it could withstand all the weight, it would obviously then tip over to one side or the other. But equally, you can't put dry dock blocks just anywhere, because if you just put it against a portion of the ship's hull plating, it'll just punch through said hull plating. So you need specifically strengthened portions of the ship to place the dry dock blocks on, and if you don't have those, well, you're in a lot of trouble, which is why ships are designed with them. This also makes the skegs, incidentally, particularly strong compared to skegs that are there purely just to support the propeller shafts. You'll also see lots of little boxes and so forth sticking out of the ship at various points underneath the waterline. Now, some of these, much smaller ones, will just be dead eyes for hanging chains and so forth if you needed to do something like, say, remove the propellers or adjust the rudders or so on. But the bigger ones that look like little trapezoid boxes are actually covering intakes within the ship. Now, those intakes are for bringing water in or potentially expelling water if the need arises. But of course, that is needed when the ship's power plant is being used and everything is working properly while the ship's underway. And since the ship is not going to be going anywhere under her own power anytime soon, those intakes and so forth are just gaps in the hull which are not necessary but would potentially allow water in, which would be bad. And so they've all been capped. In fact, they were capped when the ship was put into reserve with the intention of her becoming a museum ship. And part of the process during the dry docking was to check the watertight integrity of them all and either replace or repair them as necessary where leaks were found to occur. And they did know going into the dry dock that at least some of those had failed. And it was fairly easy to tell where they'd failed once they got into dry dock, because obviously water goes in, water comes out. But there was an awful lot of pressure testing involved as well. And as you can see, we are temporarily back above the ship, just looking down the port side here, looking particularly at turret 3. You can see there the range finder for turret 3 if it had to operate under local control, sticking out like a pair of big ears. Originally, all the turrets on the Iowa class had this, but if you look at them, you'll now find turret 1 generally has had those removed. And then we're going to drop back under the hull. As you can see now, looking up underneath, you can see the draft marks there. That tells you how much the ship is above or below the waterline. But as we pan down, we are now going to try and proceed into that area between the skegs. This is called the Holland Tunnel. No particularly discernible reason why that particular name was chosen, but if you're on the tour, then you'll know you get to walk down here and under the ship. And as we're going on, you can see some of these covered intakes coming up here, just sort of center top at the moment, and we'll see those in a bit more detail as we proceed onwards. What are fairly obvious as two big, slightly discoloured patches on the inside. Those are for inspection hatches into the skegs, which are, of course, hollow. But again, as the ship doesn't actually need to be inspected in that manner anymore, they were covered over and painted over. There's a really good view, actually, of some of those intakes just on the top right at the moment. And you can see there the final extension of the ship's keel, the main keel there, right down in the middle. And that's sitting on its own blocks. Now, there was some vibration issues with the Iowas, perhaps not as much as you would have with the North Carolinas, thank goodness, but the Holland Tunnel is actually now a prime suspect in that, because, as most of you will know, if you confine something but then expand the volume from one end to the other, you will end up with an increase in speed. And of course, as you can see down here, right at the base of the Holland Tunnel, there isn't a huge amount of cross-sectional area, whereas back up there where the props are, there's a huge amount of cross-sectional area. So the theory runs that obviously water is being pushed under the ship as the ship moves on. It then enters the Holland Tunnel, and at this end, there's not a huge amount of surface area or volume, as we said, depending on if you're looking at a cross-section or as a whole. But as you proceed back up, because you're going past the anodes and so forth, with all this extra space, you get the Venturi effect, and that water in between is going to accelerate. It's going to then exit roughly where we are at the moment at a slightly higher speed than the water that's gone around the rest of the hull. And that is then going to form a differential force on the inboard props and potentially a little bit against the hull as well. And this could be the cause of some of those vibration effects that you got on the stern of the Iowas, especially when they were going at speed. One of the big clues that it wasn't a resonance issue was that it just seemed to be directly proportional to how fast the ship was going, rather than peaking at a specific point, which, of course, on the North Carolinas, where it very definitely was a resonance issue, it would just peak initially, admittedly, right at top speed, but then by playing around with the types of propeller blades and so forth, they actually managed to move that resonance point to a relatively unused section of the speed paradigm of 17 to 19 knots. And that also gives you a view that very few people are ever going to see in real life, which was obviously a view through the Holland Tunnel of an Iowa-class battleship. It's even more spectacular when you're actually there, or I suppose if you're watching on a big screen. Now, one of the things you're going to see as we travel down the ship's side in a minute is a lot of pitting on the underside of the hull. This is thanks to a slight miscalculation on the US Navy's part, because of course you've got the magnesium bronze propellers, which we're going past at the moment, and they've been painted black in part to prevent this kind of issue. But if you have differential metals, then if they're especially in salt water, you're going to get galvanic corrosion. Now, the other three ships all got a inboard electrical protection system right from the get-go when such a system was devised. Unfortunately, New Jersey, although being measured and being the test bed for it, didn't actually receive it until the next time she went into dry dock. And of course, during that time, various bits of the ship's steel went, I'd rather be over with the propellers. And so off they went on electrical currents. And that meant that there was a huge amount of pitting on the underside of the ship. That's nothing to do with the conservation of the ship since she's become a museum. That's purely, if you like, action damage from when she was actively in US Navy service. And now we do what I term the most nerve-wracking element of this entire drone flight, when I fly the drone down the side of the ship. And as you can see, it gets very, very, very narrow. And I had to actually switch off the active collision avoidance except for specific arcs, because the gap it actually considered too narrow at one point and refused to proceed. So I had to tell it, well, actually, no, we only pay attention to collision avoidance on one side, and then it would allow me through. But anyway, as you can see, here are the various hull plates, and you can see that pitting starting up. And another thing which is actually coming up pretty much center view at the moment is the bilge keel. And the bilge keel is not for putting blocks on. It is completely hollow. If you put blocks on it, it would crush horribly. But it is to dampen out the ship's roll. And that's obviously very useful for keeping it as a stable gun platform, and also makes it a very popular measure for people aboard the ship when the ship is in rough seas. You can see here at the moment, actually, that's the anti-collision sensors picking up that dripping water coming down from on high and not wanting to hit that. Now, the interesting thing about the bilge keel is it gets hit an awful lot, and that's to the point that large sections of it were actually replaced while she was in active service because it was so bent and mangled. But you can actually look at it, obviously, as you're passing it if you're in the dry dock itself. There's some really badly pitted plating coming past you, by the way. But even with this drone flight, you can look at it and you can see areas where it was originally bent, but considered not badly bent enough to be replaced. You can also see areas, those will be riveted, by the way. You can also see areas that are somewhat smoother, welded areas where a replacement bilge keel has been put in. But even some of those replacement welded areas have been bent in at various points by various things bumping the ship, whether that's the ship bumping into the sides of things, or probably not the seabed, or various other ships bumping her, or all sorts of other things. I mean, we are still talking steel, so it takes a fair effort to bend and break it, but that is still definitely a thing. We're actually also, incidentally, as you can probably tell if you know enough about the layout of these ships, if you look at the way the plates to the right are arranged, we're also traveling just below the level of the ship's belt armor. So we're in torpedo defense area at this point. And if you're wondering what the thin grey lines are on the ship as opposed to the big silvery lines of the aluminium blocks, this is a bunch of caulking, as when they took the ship into dry dock, they discovered there was a bunch of old caulking in place. They didn't know exactly why the Navy put it in place, but they did, so they had to find the original spec caulking and replace it all, because of course the jet blasting that they did to take off all the old paint and the rust and so forth also removed any of the old caulking. One of the other things you'll notice as we go along is you can also see riveting on the plates. Now, riveting was mostly used in the ship's construction, except up at the bow, where the plating is a lot thinner. But again, you will occasionally see plates that have been welded in place, which are replacement plates that the Navy's put in at various points in time as the ship has gone into and out of dry dock. Now, bear in mind, this is a very small drone I'm flying along here, so this gives you an idea of just how precise the guys working the dry dock had to be to get this ship in, because you don't want to scrape it any more than it already has been. Now, another thing you might notice is that the boot topping, that black line there, is not in line with the ship's plating, and there is a good reason for that. That's because in her unloaded state, New Jersey floats with a considerable stern trim. So if she had her historical boot topping line, it would look like she's riding very proud of the water up front, which in fact she is, but it would also look very silly. So what 2 out of the 4 Iowa class have done at various points is actually have their boot topping lines repainted so she looks on a more even keel, which is also part of the reason why if you're actually aboard one of these museum ships while they're in the water, the slope up the bow seems considerably steeper than if you're walking that same slope while she is in dry dock, where of course she is actually on a true level. And if you remember that blocking pattern from earlier, now, of course, the ship is pretty much just on those center blocks because the docking keels, well, they've gone away because the ship's hull has gone considerably narrower. Now, at some point, the drone's going to run into an invisible geofence, which is the 0 altitude flight limit for the Philadelphia airport, which I think is actually, looking on the map and looking at where the geofence kicked in, I think the FAA have slightly misplaced it by a few dozen feet, which is annoying because it means we can't fly up to the bow of the ship. We can only fly close to and then proceed forth without hitting these lines. The bow plating, as I mentioned before, is somewhat thinner and all welded into place, so you won't see any rivets now passing by on your right. And that's just in an effort to make the bow as light as humanly possible, because of course it's got a very narrow beam, and a very narrow beam means that because it's quite tall, it actually theoretically has a negative buoyancy. So even if the bow was completely watertight and you cut it off, and obviously you somehow maintain that watertightness, it would be negatively buoyant and sink. So every ton of weight that you can save is better because it means the ship will plunge somewhat less. And as some of you will know, the bow plunging and getting water green over it was a little bit of a problem on some of the Iowa class in rough weather. But it also means that as thin plating, as you can see here, especially at the boot topping, it's much easier to dent this hull plating. And just down there, well, you saw, with rising away from it, another few of those covers which have been plated over or boxed over and sealed, and a few more of the scuff marks from the tugs. Also, you might notice a bunch of D-rings up here, whereas further back on the bow, on the hull, those D-rings are not present. That's because at this point, the overhang of the bow of the ship is enough that if you hang painting cradles down in day-to-day active service, the guys on the painting cradles won't actually be able to reach the side of the ship. So over here, you have all these little D-rings, which you can then clip those cradles to, or a painting float or something like that, so you can actually keep the bow painted up as well. And at this stage in proceedings, the ship had yet to be fleeted, which is essentially reflooding the dry dock, moving the ship 4 feet forward, and then you can paint all the areas that the keel blocks are not allowing you to paint at this point. So this is as far forward as the geofence will allow us to go, and so we're going to rise up and have a look at New Jersey from this direction. So this kind of view, this is actually not the view you could get while she's in port, because of course we're looking at her port side, which is the side that is out on the Delaware River normally, whereas the starboard side is the side that you would be able to view from the dockside in Camden. But of course also they don't have a big viewing tower up near the bow, so again trying to avoid all the lines that are holding her in place, or would hold her in place when she's afloat, we're going to get you a nice good view of an Iowa class battleship as we rise up. Unfortunately, also the wind was fairly light, which was a very, very good thing, because obviously small drone, high winds, it might end up wandering into areas where it very definitely isn't welcome. It also means, unfortunately, we won't get a view of the little bulbous foot, or particularly good view of the bulbous foot, but you can see there the caisson. So this dry dock, like many dry docks, is caisson rather than gate activated. So that caisson is hollow and can be flooded. So when we came in, the caisson was actually on that pier round the other side of it. And then once the ship is in place, then you get tugs to bring the caisson in, and then the caisson is flooded and it slots down into an inverse trapezoidal slot, and that seals it. Now, at the time it actually was sealed, of course, the Delaware River is full of all sorts of interesting detritus, so it actually came down on a log, so it wasn't fully sealing, so they had to then lighten it to raise it a little bit, and diver had to go down and retrieve some debris, clear it out, and then they could drop it down and start the training process in earnest. Now, down back at the bulbous foot of the ship, there is a round patch, which obviously we can't see because we can't fly the drone around there, but just assure you that it is there. Now, unlike the other ships in her class, that is where a paravane ring was originally fitted for counter mining purposes or minesweeping purposes. But later on in the ship's career, it was considered that they didn't need it anymore, so they just took it off. And while we're up here, you can actually see just to the left there the area of deck that's being replaced. Just to the right there, those grey hatch-covered areas are actually the coverings for the pump houses that pump all the water out of this dry dock. And since we're in the direct vicinity of the superstructure, and thus no danger to anyone except to ourselves, we can also proceed briefly to have a look at the superstructure of the ship. So you can see here you've got the phalanxes, you've got 5-inch 38s, you've got one of the anti-aircraft fire control systems there, and the conning tower sitting just above the bridge. Obviously that extends quite deeply into the bridge. These two long antennas sticking out of the bridge up front, which I always think they should kind of motorise to wave back and forth because they look a little bit like insect feelers to me. And then as we rise up, you'll be able to see the primary rangefinder system for the fire control, as well as a bunch of radar, some closer to the World War II period, some considerably later than the World War II period, and of course my part-time nemesis, a somewhat cut down mast so that she could fit under the bridge. And at the time that this video should be going live, it will be just a couple of weeks after she's actually had that section of her mast refitted. That was left behind in Camden because there wasn't really much point in bringing it over here to the Navy Yard. If you look very carefully in the centre there, you can see some chaff launchers clustered around the port side 5-inch 38 fire control system. And then, of course, we're looking down on the forward turrets. The superfiring one, helpfully, is named Turret 6-2 and is labelled as such. And you've got the breakwater and the bow looking out over the Delaware River and over to the opposite side. That is New Jersey. On the other side of the river, we are, of course, in Pennsylvania. And the eagle-eyed amongst you might be able to spot the shadow of a particularly large seagull that had taken objection to the existence of the drone, hence why at this point we are very rapidly skedaddling forwards so that I can drop it back down into the dry dock, just passing over the site of some gun tubs for Bofors 40mm, which obviously are now no longer in existence. There's that silly Christmas tree of an aerial, there's the gun tubs again, and a little bit of a better view on the work that's being done to the forward deck at this point. Obviously, hopefully, I think by the time this video has come out, that work has been completed. Now, I mentioned there's a little bit of a funny story about the ship and her launch, which took place on the slipway just a little bit to the left on the other side of this building now. And that involves a little bit of overestimation, or perhaps underestimation, take your choice. Essentially, when she was launched, New Jersey was the single heaviest object to have been launched from that slipway. And indeed, apart from USS Iowa, the single heaviest thing to have been launched for the US Navy. And there was a degree of concern as to whether she was going to stick on the slipway, or worse still, maybe move slightly, stick, and then with all that force coming to a sudden and dead halt, that might tip her out of the launch cradle, which would be even worse. And so they decided that they were going to try and expedite the ship's journey down the slipway. Well, how do you do this, you might ask? Well, you appropriate a lot of lard, several thousand pounds of it. And yes, you grease the slipway completely. This, in theory, would allow for the over 30,000 tons of incomplete battleship to coast nice and neatly down the slipway and into the water. It worked. It worked far, far too well. So, as some of you will be aware, when a ship is launched, it generally is dragging a whole ton of chain from the bow, because that acts essentially as a friction brake to slow the ship down, because you don't want it going too quickly. Well, they let New Jersey go, and she began to accelerate down the slipway, and kept accelerating, and kept accelerating, and soon a bunch of the chains that were supposed to be restricting her capability to move were essentially flying out behind her in the manner of penance. And if anyone got anywhere close to them, that was a very good way to lose parts of your anatomy that you would rather keep attached. And down she raced into the water and kept going straight past the tugs, who were there to supposedly maneuver her once she'd finished her launch sequence, the tugs rather sensibly saw the onrushing behemoth and just said, well, I'm going to stay here to one side, and watched in bemusement as 35,000 tons of newly launched battleship raced past them, doing a rather impressive rate of knots for a ship that didn't have any working engines at this point, didn't even have the propellers fitted. And New Jersey went coasting off to the other side of the Delaware, where she bumped up against the New Jersey shoreline. So some people said, oh yeah, well, she was just eager to go visit her home state. Meanwhile, everyone else was going, well, let's not waste all that lard again, shall we? Incidentally, that was enough lard to make cookies for basically everybody who was in the US Armed Services at the time. Gives you some idea of the sheer quantity of lard involved. I'm sure the seagulls had great feasts thereafter. And then once they were absolutely sure that the New Jersey had in fact decided she was going to stop moving, the tugs went over, fished her off the shore, and brought her back, and that's how she ended up in this dry dock in the first place. Not because she'd taken any particular damage, she was always due to end up in this dry dock after launch. It was just a bit more dramatic than they had perhaps otherwise planned. And as you can see, we have once again run into the geofence, that is as far forward as the drone is physically allowed to go. So we'll pan back across. It was a rather nice day. As you can tell, the wind was beginning to pick up at this point. And, of course, many thanks to the crew of USS New Jersey, Ryan and Libby, for facilitating my access to the ship, and all the other docents and staff who keep the ship running. Of course, also massive thanks to all of you who came to tour the ship in dry dock, because your donations helped to complete work on the ship, both complete work that needed to be done and complete a few bits and pieces that were on a little bit of a wish list, and will help the ship stay as a museum for considerably longer than otherwise. And a special thanks, obviously, to those of you who came out specifically to say hi to me and to be guided around the ship by me. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed your day, and you made sure to retain your souvenir hard hat and various other bits and pieces that, of course, you could pick up there. I picked up, and I think they are still available as well, a little vial of rust that had been removed from the New Jersey. So I've dubbed this New Jersey's phylactery, and it is now buried in an unknown part of England. Thus, should anything happen to New Jersey, I believe, in theory, with a high enough level wizard, we can then bring her back. And if you want to pick up some of the remaining dry dock merch, I believe it is still available on the Battleship New Jersey website. And as I mentioned at the start of this video, I will be aboard USS New Jersey on the 26th of October. If you want to come to the Leyte Golf Symposium that the ship is running, of course, I will be more than happy to see you there. But if for whatever reason you can't make it to the symposium itself, maybe they've sold out of tickets or whatever, I will be on and around the ship generally during opening hours as well. So obviously let me know via Discord or email if you're going to do that and you want to meet up, because she is a rather large ship, and just relying on running into me at random, although it does work out surprisingly often, may not work out for you, because, I might be somewhere completely different, several hundred feet away from you linearly and several dozen feet away from you vertically. And, well, New Jersey is not really built for people just yelling out people's names. Well, you can try, just won't get very far. And of course, don't forget there are other US museum ships that are heading for dry dock or in dry dock at this moment as we speak. The destroyer USS Kidd, star of the movie Greyhound, is currently in dry dock down in Louisiana, so you can go and give them a little bit of support if you like. USS The Sullivans will hopefully be going into dry dock next year. And of course, USS Texas has come out of dry dock earlier in 2024, but conservation work is still ongoing for her. And just as a little bit of an update, those of you who applied for the giveaway for free tickets to a tour with me in the dry dock with USS New Jersey and who were unsuccessful, you'll be aware that I did promise there was going to be a custom specific limited run poster made. That is still going to happen. It's just the artwork is taking a little bit longer to make than we otherwise thought it would be. And for everybody else, there are going to be two bits of artwork. One is custom for the people who were either in the dry dock or applied for the giveaway, and the other one will be publicly available to commemorate New Jersey going into dry dock successfully. And yes, of course, it will feature a black dragon, because that is New Jersey's nickname. So as we wrap up here with a final pan around, you can see one of the tour groups merrily wandering around, very confused as to why there's a buzzy thing in the dry dock itself. And as we head back up, you can just see there, probably the best view you'll get from a drone of the bulbous foot, some of the markings from the tugs, the D-rings I mentioned earlier, the BB62 number there, anchor, which is not going to be used in any kind of handbrake turn anytime soon, thank goodness. And the weird little symbol that you might have just briefly spotted there on the bow near the draft markers, that's actually there, put there on US ships that are in the reserve fleet, because then a ship in the reserves is obviously going to be riding a little bit high because they're not going to have food and fuel and other stores aboard. So if somebody is checking in on all the ships in the reserve fleet, it's a very easy visual reference. Can you see that mark? If yes, the ship is doing fine. If you can't, then that means the ship has settled in the water more than it should, and that is not a good thing. But hopefully you've enjoyed this little dry dock tour of USS New Jersey. Hopefully you'll come and see the ship at some point soon, and if you can't, hopefully this has given you an idea of just what it's like to have a battleship in dry dock. Bye for now.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.